David Moore first discovered the geometry of possibility long before he ever held a T-square in his hand. In the cramped living room of his grandmother's modest brick bungalow, he spent hours folding scrap paper into miniature skyscrapers, lining them up on the coffee table, as if he could already see them piercing the skyline. His grandmother would peer over his shoulder, her dark eyes alight with pride, and gently correct a crooked roof or nudged a tilted column back into perfect balance. Architecture, she told him, is not just walls and windows. It's the poetry of shelter. At home, his mother juggled two retail jobs to keep the lights on, but she never failed to praise David's sketches, even when he had no frame in which to hang them. She saved every pay stub so he could buy basic drafting tools: a battered wooden pencil, a stubby eraser, a yellowed pad of graph paper. When the local community center posted a flyer announcing a youth art scholarship, David poured his savings and his imagination into preparing a portfolio: hand-drawn renderings of floating gardens and glass pavilions draped in ivy. He stayed up late, shading each line until it looked as solid as stone, fueled by his grandmother's steady mantra, "Build your dreams." Winning that first scholarship felt like breaking through an invisible ceiling. It paid for after-school classes in geometry and basic engineering, where he learned to translate his vivid daydreams into technical precision. At 17, he earned a full ride to the State University's architecture program, the first in his family to step onto a college campus. He arrived clutching that battered pad of graph paper and a heart full of hope, only to find that the lecture halls were filled with students from old money and legacy firms whose names slipped off the tongue like polished marble. The dean welcomed him with a nod, but the industry connections that flowed through hollows of privilege seemed almost impossible to bridge. Yet David refused to shrink. He carried his grandmother's wisdom in his pocket, a small carved wooden cube she had given him on graduation day, and poured himself into studios and late-night critiques. He gravitated toward professors who spoke of sustainable design and social equity, absorbing lessons in passive cooling, rainwater harvesting, and the art of using reclaimed wood as structural elegance. His classmates marveled at the warmth of his timber frame models and the green roof sketches that bristled with native wildflowers. When he graduated with honors, he chose not to pursue the glittering glass towers offered by global firms. Instead, he joined a tiny black-owned practice in his hometown, drawn by its mission to create low-income housing that felt both beautiful and dignified. In that cramped office above a corner bookstore, David spent his days sketching community centers with curved walls that invited conversation, libraries whose solar-shaded louvers cooled reading rooms without air conditioning, and mixed-use developments that grew their own gardens on every rooftop. His concepts blended structural innovation with human stories: the sick grandmother who could read under filtered daylight, the young mother who could gather rainwater to water her rooftop vegetables, the children who could play in shaded courtyards built into the building's bones. For David, every line on the blueprint was a promise that architecture could heal as much as it could protect, and that the city he loved deserved nothing less than a design born of compassion, intellect, and unwavering pride. David arrived at the competition announcement with a mixture of excitement and resolve, convinced that his vision for the Riverfront Civic Plaza could finally break through the barriers he'd long encountered. He had spent weeks refining every detail: the way sunlight would filter through the twisting wooden ribs of his pavilion at dawn, the curve of the living walls that would hold native grasses and flowers, the network of terraced rain gardens designed to cleanse the river's polluted runoff. His presentation boards were mounted on foam core, each rendering hand-touched to bring out the warmth of the reclaimed timber and the soft glow of integrated solar panels. He wore his crisply tailored blazer, an inheritance from his mother's saving, and carried his laser-printed proposals in a leather portfolio that bore the faint scent of cedar shavings. Inside the stately conference room, portraits of past civic projects gazed down from paneled walls as architects and city officials gathered behind a long mahogany table. The air was cool, the soft click of heels and polished shoes echoing on marble floors as participants arranged their submissions. David laid his boards face up, careful to place them at the exact center of the table, believing that this symmetry spoke of thoughtful design. He caught a few polite nods, but also the flicker of raised eyebrows when one of the senior jurors, whose firm had designed half the city's corporate plazas, glanced at the organic curves of David's proposal and then back to the rigid lines of the next competitor's glass box. When the jurors convened to discuss entries, David found himself hovering near the doorway, listening as his name was mentioned in polite terms. "Interesting use of reclaimed timber," one juror murmured, tapping a finger on his chin. Another sighed. "The community workshops are admirable, but are we certain the public will tolerate that much greenery in a prime commercial zone?" A third juror, a partner at a venerable firm, leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "It's risky. This is a flagship project. We need something that signals stability, not experimentation." Their voices, hushed but clear, carried an undercurrent David recognized all too well: the safe, familiar territory of whitewashed tradition. Weeks later, the city posted the winning design, a sleek rectangular pavilion of mirrored glass and steel, its minimalism touted as a timeless aesthetic. David stood at the riverbank, printout of the official announcement shaking in his hand as the wind whipped through his coat. The very spot he had imagined, transformed by living walls and wooden arches, remained a blank expanse of gravel and broken concrete. He felt a hollow ache, a blend of frustration and sorrow as pedestrians strolled past, oblivious to the competition that had excluded his dream. Yet beneath the disappointment, a stubborn ember glowed. If his design was too daring for the jury, perhaps the city itself was ready to show them otherwise. He folded the announcement into his pocket, straightened his shoulders, and walked away with a new determination to prove that true innovation thrives where courage and community converge. David refused to let his vision die in a jury room. Within days of the announcement, he sat alone on the riverbank at dawn, sketchbook open on his lap, as the city woke around him. He posted his first renderings to social media that morning, high-resolution images of the timber ribs reaching skyward, like the ribs of a great whale, of the living walls moss-green with ferns and wildflowers, and asked a simple question: what if our riverfront could breathe again? Replies trickled in at first. Curious architects tagging colleagues, a handful of residents asking where they could see more. Encouraged, David created a short video walkthrough, narrating in calm, confident tones how rainwater would cascade through terraced channels into planted basins, how solar fins would track the sun arc by arc, how benches carved of reclaimed oak would invite families to pause and watch migrating birds. By week's end, his post had gone viral among local design blogs. One architecture influencer praised it as a blueprint for community renewal. Another called it the People's Pavilion. Anonymous retweets spread across Twitter, and soon, the city's hashtag for the plaza competition was overrun with enthusiastic images of David's concept framed against photos of the neighborhood he'd roamed as a child. Energized by the momentum, he set up a folding table and easel near a cracked concrete embankment, pinned large-scale prints to a chain-link fence, and invited passersby to pin colored post-its wherever they wanted benches, gardens, or performance stages. A group of teenagers dropped off with skateboards, stopped to draw their own suggestions. A retired teacher sealed her post-it with a proud flourish. Word of mouth turned the pop-up into an impromptu town hall. A local food truck offered free coffee to everyone who signed his guest book, and a reporter from the city paper arrived to capture the scene. Neighbors who'd never known his name shared stories of decades spent walking the riverbank, lamenting how industry had choked the water's edge. One resident, who'd lost her home to spring floods, recounted how the terraced rain gardens could have spared her family. Each testimony David wove into his evolving proposal, annotating his sketches with the human voices he encountered. By the time he posted the final community-informed design, complete with actual notes from children, gardeners, and cyclists, it wasn't just an individual's dream, but a collective manifesto. The online vote that followed saw his design outpoll every official finalist by more than 2-1. Comments flooded in. "This is ours. Finally, a design that listens." David did what the jury wouldn't. As the share counts climbed into the tens of thousands, Even city council members took notice, forwarding his link in their staff meetings. Conferences that once excluded him now hustled to understand how a lone architect had turned a closed competition into a democratic triumph. Standing again on the riverbank at dusk, David watched his printed plans fluttering in the breeze and felt a fierce joy. He had built something far stronger than a pavilion, a movement that could not be ignored. The city council chambers hummed with an unusual buzz on the morning the public vote opened. Rows of easels displaying each finalist's renderings lined the polished corridor outside, but crowds clustered almost entirely in front of David's panels. His timber and green-walled pavilion glowed in the soft morning light of the printed posters, and residents leaned in to trace the curves of the wooden ribs, to imagine children climbing the mossy terraces he had designed, to picture families picnicking beneath living roofs. Volunteers in bright shirts guided voters through a touchscreen ballot system. But so many people were drawn to the analog charm of David's hand-inked sketches that the touchscreen table closest to his display literally groaned under the weight of shoulder-to-shoulder citizens eager to weight their voices toward his vision. As the day wore on, snippets of conversation drifted through the crowd. Gardeners discussing which native wildflowers would thrive best in the living walls. Canoeists planning how the terraced rain gardens could ease their past struggles with flooding. Even local business owners calculating how picnic tables and kiosks beneath solar fins could boost foot traffic. David moved quietly among them, accepting warm handshakes and questions. How deep will the soil beds be? Will the pavilion's timber age to a silvery patina? And answering with the same steady passion he'd poured into his late-night studio sessions. Every conversation, every nod of approval felt like another brick laid in the foundation of a grassroots mandate. By late afternoon, the vote counters began tallying on a large screen behind the council dais. One by one, officials announced percentages for each design. The glass and steel entry peaked at 15%. The minimalist concrete pavilion barely scraped 10%. But when the final numbers appeared beside David's name, the room erupted. 68% of the ballots, drawn from every district of the city, bore his vision as their choice. Applause thundered through the chambers, shouts of "David!" echoing off marble columns. Council members who had once nodded politely over his rejection now rose to their feet, cheering as though they had discovered his design anew. Outside, local news crews scrambled to capture the moment. Cameras angled toward David's animated walkthrough video on handheld monitors, as reporters shouted questions. How does it feel to win nearly 70% of the public's vote? What lessons will this teach future competitions? Under the glare of bright lights, David spoke with calm conviction, his words crisp. He thanked his neighbors for speaking up, called the vote a testament to what can happen when a city listens, and urged the council to honor not only the letter of the vote, but the spirit of community collaboration it represented. Sound bites of his interview cut through social media feeds that evening. "A pavilion by the people for the people," proclaimed one clip, while another framed him smiling at children's drawings pinned to his renderings. When the sun dipped low and the screens went dark, David stood alone for a moment before the empty easels. He ran a hand along the printed timber ribs of his pavilion, tracing the contours that had turned from his notebook into the city's collective dream. He imagined the real arches rising on the riverbank, sunlight filtering through living walls, water flowing through gardens. He had never meant to design alone. In that quiet hour, with the city's mandate fresh in his heart, he felt the full weight of responsibility and the exhilarating certainty that his design would no longer be just his vision, but the living, breathing heart of a community reborn. David stepped into the marbled grandeur of the city's ceremonial chamber, the hush of the late afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows above. Around the long oak table sat the very jurors who had dismissed his vision, their crisp suits and polished shoes speaking of boardrooms he'd once only imagined. When the mayor called his name and extended a sealed envelope containing the project contract, David felt the weight of every doubt he'd ever faced settle into something solid at his feet. He cleared his throat, unfolded the documents, and traced his fingertip along the flowing lines of the contract's cover. His blueprint of timber ribs and living walls now transformed into legal promise. As he signed the first page, a ripple of applause ran through the assembly. Senior partners from the legacy firms, whose glass and steel proposal had beaten him in private, offered strained smiles and polite nods. Their congratulations were courteous, but David sensed the unease behind their eyes. They recognized that his success was not a fluke of public sentiment, but the revelation of a deeper truth, that architecture must belong to the people it serves. He rose, voice steady, and addressed the gathering with a firmness born of every hour spent drafting and reworking his designs beneath lamplight and river breeze alike. He spoke of community apprenticeships, of on-site workshops, where neighbors could learn the craft of carpentry and green roof maintenance, and of a dedication to hiring 50% of the construction crew from local vocational programs. Over the next hour, he sat with city procurement officers, negotiating milestone payments, tied not just to bricks and mortar, but to metrics of ecological performance and social impact. He insisted on quarterly public forums, where residents could review progress photos and offer tweaks, perhaps a new species of wildflower for the living walls, or a relocated bench closer to the water's edge. Each clause he added felt like another layer of accountability, another safeguard against the old model of exclusion. When the final signature was affixed, the chamber exhaled in unison, the document now a living accord between boundary-breaking design and institutional power. Outside, as cameras clicked and construction helmets were presented for a photo opportunity, David slipped away to the riverbank. He closed his eyes against the golden light on the water and breathed in the scent of damp earth and cedar. The contract tucked safely in his satchel was more than paper. It was a bridge between outsider and insider, an invitation to reshape not only a neglected shore, but the very rules by which visions were judged. And as the first prefabricated timber arches gleamed on the horizon, he knew that his pavilion would stand as proof that, when a city listens, an architect's voice can become the blueprint for collective transformation. Dawn's pale light was just beginning to lighten the sky when David arrived at the riverbank, hard hat in hand and breath visible in the crisp morning air. The site, once a stretch of cracked concrete and tangled weeds, had already been edged with temporary fencing and flagged for excavation. A line of neighbors and local apprentices gathered along the perimeter. Students from the vocational program he'd championed, retirees who had shared their memories of the polluted waters, and curious families drawn by posters and neighborhood windows. They huddled in knit hats and scarves, steaming cups of coffee warming their palms, eyes bright with anticipation that felt almost electric. Behind them, heavy machinery waited like mechanical beasts, steel arms poised to break the ground that had lain dormant for decades. City officials in borrowed hard hats stood to one side, greeting each community volunteer with perfunctory handshakes. David paused at the edge of the maintenance path, glancing down at the first stake he and the project manager had driven the week before. A simple wooden post marked tree bench. He recalled the small group of children who, only days ago, had clustered around that stake, each pressing a thumbprint into the damp clay soil, claiming their future picnic spot. He felt their trust settle in his chest like a heartbeat. When the project manager raised a microphone, the crowd fell quiet. David spoke first, his voice steady but warm, thanking everyone for believing in a dream that originated in his grandmother's living room and took shape through countless late nights of sketching and community workshops. He spoke of timber ribs rising to meet the sky and living walls breathing with native ferns. But he also spoke of the workers who would learn new carpentry skills, the apprentices who would find a future in green construction, and the volunteers who would help plant the first seeds. As he finished, he tapped the ceremonial shovel into the earth, and all around him, shovels met soil in a synchronized rhythm, sending clouds of dust into the cool breeze. In the hours that followed, the excavator's arms swung to and fro, ripping up old concrete as David guided the operator to preserve the old granite curbs for reuse in seating walls. Apprentices watched intently, some shivering despite their layers, but eager to see the first real steps of construction. Nearby, a photographer from the architectural press snapped images of the teetering mounds of rubble, now reborn as the raw material for terraced planter beds. Even the city's traditionalist aldermen, once openly skeptical of David's reclaimed materials scheme, stood quietly at the edge, nodding as he observed the efficiency of sorting debris into piles for crushing, sorting, and reuse. By midday, sunlight danced on the sculpted pile of harvested oak beams salvaged from a demolished barn, their rough-hewn surfaces shining with promise. David knelt beside a volunteer from the neighborhood gardening club and helped lay out the first row of rain garden basins, explaining how the graded slopes would channel stormwater into reed-filled swales. Children clustered nearby, drawing wet footprints in the soil as they asked endless questions. How tall will the arches be? Can we plant sunflowers here? With each answer, David felt the project breathe more vibrantly, pulsing with collective ownership instead of corporate decree. As the sun slipped toward afternoon, the din of machines softened into the quiet hum of progress, gears turning, water trickling through test channels, and the murmur of planning conversations among site supervisors and community monitors. David paused once more at the water's edge, running a gloved hand over a pile of stones destined for a new seating terrace. He closed his eyes and listened, the steady rumble of construction, the distant laughter of apprentices on their lunch break, and the faint call of a heron, returning, perhaps, to a river that would soon be reborn. In that moment, David knew that breaking ground was more than a ceremonial gesture. It was the physical embodiment of every barrier he'd overcome, every voice he'd rallied, and every life he'd hoped to change. And as the first real stones settled into place, he felt the pulse of his community thrum beneath his feet, strong and unshakable. The morning sunlight danced across the woven wooden ribs of the pavilion, as families and city officials gathered on the newly terraced lawns. Children ran between the planters, their laughter mingling with the soft trickle of water flowing through the rain gardens. David stood just off to the side, feeling the warmth of the crowd's excitement wash over him. He watched as the mayor cut the ribbon, an elegant strip of green ribbon embroidered with the names of every community volunteer, then stepped aside to let a line of neighborhood elders, apprentices, and schoolchildren spill into the space they had helped create. The living walls glowed with ferns and wildflowers that only days before had been mere seedlings, and the reclaimed oak benches bore freshly carved names of local families. As the crowd explored every corner, venturing onto the rooftop garden terraces, tracing the gentle curves of the sunlit benches, marveling at the way the timber arches framed views of the river. Photographers snapped shots that would appear in architectural journals and social feeds around the world. Awards were announced in real time: national sustainability honors, innovation medals for public engagement, and a special community choice prize that David lifted with modest pride. But the greatest accolade came from a little girl in a pink raincoat who tugged at his sleeve and asked if she could plant a sunflower there next spring. When he nodded, she ran off to grab her mother's hand, already plotting her own patch of green in the living wall. In the weeks that followed, the city council convened to rewrite its procurement code, embedding community-led design as a requirement for every future public project. David's scholarship fund pledged to send 10 underrepresented architecture students to summer studios, and the apprenticeship program he championed celebrated its first graduates, now securely employed in green construction firms across the region. Late one afternoon, as the sun set behind the pavilion and the lanterns along the walkways flickered on, David lingered beneath the timber ribs, listening to the hum of contented voices. In the golden light, he could almost hear his grandmother's gentle words echoing that architecture was the poetry of shelter. Here, at last, was a poem written by many hands, standing not just as a landmark, but as a living testament to what happens when talent is not blocked, but embraced, and when a single dream is allowed to become the foundation for a community's most vibrant hope.